Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. Episode 44, Sir John Kincaid, the possible inspiration for Sharpe's rifles. We have a special episode for you today. We are joined by my good friend Luke Reynolds. He's a professor at the University of Connecticut Stamford campus, and he's also author of a book called Who Owned Waterloo? And if you'd like to order this fantastic book, you can get on Amazon or anywhere books are found online, or you can go to lukealreynolds.com. Luke, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
What is Who Owned Waterloo about? Can you tell us a bit more about that book?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a cultural history. It's actually not about the battle itself. I say that it starts the morning after the battle and goes from there. And it's really about Waterloo's memory in Britain.
Yeah, we were talking before we came on, and I was like, why is Waterloo so fascinating? And you made a great point. It's a tidy way to end an epic era of the Napoleonic age, don't you think?
Exactly. I mean, think about this is the analogy I often use. Think about how many modern movie, TV, book reviews you read that say like this is great, but it doesn't stick the landing. We're conditioned to want an epic conclusion, something that wraps everything up with a bow, and Waterloo is perfect for that.
Right.
Even though there's minor conflict after it, and there's a whole bunch of debate, and there's an army of occupation for 3 more years. It's sort of considered this endpoint, and it's just very neat.
Right. And even though the battle itself was a slog and quite horrible,
yeah,
it ends everything. You're right, neatly in 1815.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's brutal. And one of the reasons it is so brutal is that it's so concentrated, right? It's actually a relatively small valley. And right. In that, you just have 3 armies just coming together to beat on each other, to put it very simply.
And all 3 armies knew what was at stake. So there really was there's no surrendering or going backwards. It was all or nothing.
Exactly. Yeah, no, very much so. Wellington is not going to move. Blucher is not going to slow down. And Napoleon is going to do everything he can to split those 2 and break them apart.
Right. Yeah, it sounds like a fascinating book. So let my audience know they should check it out.
Thank you.
My pleasure. We're going to talk today about another interesting character, and his name is Sir John Kincaid. Can you kind of give us a teaser about this fellow?
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Well, so first of all, this is worth noting. He is actually arguably, I think, the lowest ranking officer that has appeared on your podcast yet.
He is.
He only made it to captain, and that was after the war. Like he was a first lieutenant at Waterloo.
So that begs the question: why are we talking about this guy on Generals and Napoleon? He must have some story.
He does. He definitely does. He fights through the entirety of the peninsula, really, from when does he get there? He gets there in 1810.
Right.
And he's there through Toulouse and then on into Waterloo. But honestly, the real reason I like talking about him is that he has he writes 2 memoirs, and those 2 memoirs are in many ways sort of they're partially responsible for kicking off that memoir boom in the 1830s.
Right.
Especially among the rifles. He's sort of the first of the rifle officers to write about this.
Yeah, I was reading about a little bit of his Waterloo memoir today, and he's talking about heaps of bodies on the battlefield. It was very descriptive. It was almost like being there,
Yeah, I'm not going to give him full credit for this. He's not like he alone did this.
Right.
But he is one of the first examples of something I talk about in the book, which is this sort of use of only eyewitness. Right. By the time he wrote this, he had, Wellington's dispatches. He had some of Napier. Napier was publishing during this time. But he is very clearly, I am just going to be writing about what I see and what I experienced.
Well, let's dive into this fellow. Do we know a lot about his early life?
We don't know that. We know a decent amount about his early life, but it's really through him. And he was to give him credit. He was fully aware of what people were going to buy his books to read about. So he sort of glosses over it. But he was the second son of a guy by the name of John Kincaid, right? He's named after his father,
Right.
who was a lord, or rather, as Kincaid puts it, a small lowland Scottish laird of a place called Dalheath House. And this is in Falkirk in Stirlingshire. It's about 25 miles west of Edinburgh.
Got it. In Scotland. Yeah.
In Scotland, but very much lowland Scotland, right? We're not talking the Highlands here.
Right. Right. Okay.
He's born in January 1787, and he's educated locally at the Polmont School, which Polmont is just west of Falkirk. Sorry, no, just east of Falkirk. I apologize. And his father dies relatively early.
Okay.
So his mother sort of, I get the feeling his mother doesn't want their kids going away. Right. She wants them close by. And Polmont School is sort of perfect for that.
Okay.
And then he joins the North York Militia as a lieutenant, which is, pretty standard, son of a lowland Scottish laird. He's not going to serve in the ranks.
Right. He has enough minor nobility to become an officer.
Yeah, he's sort of gentry is probably the best way to put it in terms of the overarching British aristocracy.
Got it.
Very a Scottish laird, but if you show up in sort of the ton houses in London and say, I'm nobility because I'm a Scottish laird, they're going to be like, yeah, come back when you've got a dukedom or an earldom and we'll talk.
So not really high up the ladder of aristocracy.
No, very much not. And I think honestly, if his family had been English, we'd probably be talking more about sort of untitled gentry. But he has, he's got this, and it's obviously his older brother who inherits the lordship. So in 1809, this call goes out basically saying, hey, if you are in the militia, but you want to earn extra pay, you want to, get a fancier uniform, you want more attention from the ladies, they'll use anything they can get.
Right.
Switch to the regular army. And there's a draft of draft in the volunteer sense, not in the conscription sense, right, of the militia regiment that joins the 95th Rifles, and he goes with them.
And he's still fairly young at this point, like 22, 23, somewhere in there.
He was born in 87, and he transfers to the 95th in 1809.
Right. Okay. There you go. Yep.
Yeah. So April 09, and he becomes a second lieutenant in the Rifles. Got it. And he's very determined to make his mark. Right. He writes in the first chapter, and I'm going to quote here, with the usual quixotic feeling of a youngster, I remember how very desirous I was on the march to Deal, which is where the 95th were going to be based, to impress the minds of the natives with a suitable notion of the magnitude of my importance by carrying a donkey load of pistols in my belt and screwing my naturally placid countenance up to a pitch of ferocity beyond what it was calculated to bear.
Right. Okay.
So he's, very much the sort of early 20s swaggering young blood.
So my question then, and I'm sure my audience is waiting for me to ask this, how much of Sharpe's Rifles do you think is based on this fellow?
So, he's definitely of a higher birth status and a higher existence status than Richard Sharpe, right? Richard Sharpe is famous for starting in the ranks, born in the rookeries of London, right? And so there's not that, but he does fight his entire career in the 95th Rifles. He has contact with other regiments because he serves at times in sort of administrative positions for the entire Light Brigade. So he's got that. And he's definitely there. And I think, honestly, it's where the inspiration comes from is less, Sharpe's trajectory and Sharpe's sort of overwhelming narrative drive to be at the center of every battle. Right. And more just that Kincaid gives us an amazing description of everyday life in the peninsula. Yeah. And it's one of the best junior officer descriptions of everyday life, not only in the peninsula, but in the 95th.
Yeah. Yeah, that first person account is really intriguing. On the other side of the line, I just finished reading Marbeau's memoirs of, a guy who, similar, he worked his way up and he was an aide to Marshals Massena and Augereau and, really was almost at every front that Napoleon was on, in Spain and Russia. And it was just a very interesting memoir to read through.
Absolutely. One of those ones where, he sits down and he's like, all right, people are going to want to read this. There's some interesting stuff here. And then the first editor gets his hands on it. The first publisher is like, oh yeah, this is going to be fun.
Right. Well, let's get back to our protagonist. So he's just signed up. He's in the 95th Rifles. What was his first baptism of fire?
So it's not really a baptism of fire. It's actually more of a baptism of water. But he joins the 95th just in time to take part in the Walcheren expedition.
Oh gosh,
yeah, that utter disaster / nightmare / whatever you want to call it.
It was a mess.
Yeah, it really was. So he sails from Deal with the 95th on the 74-gun HMS Namur, which I love as a bit of coincidence because he starts on the Namur. And his final battle of the war would be Waterloo, which was fought astride the Brussels to Namur road.
Ah, irony.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think he clocks that, but it was something I was reading, and I was like, that's a fun bit of sort of narrative, just fate right there.
Well, to give our audience, in case they don't know of this Walcheren expedition, I know it's a mess. You want to give them a brief sketch of what happens there?
Yeah. So basically, it's an attempt by the British into the Netherlands in 1809, and it's attempts to open up another front in the Austrian Empire's struggle with France, right? To take some of the pressure off of Austria.
Yep.
And basically, it's one of those ones where, both sides are not overly pleased with it, right? But it's one where, a little bit like the Crimea, it's conditions and sickness that are doing more damage than bullets can ever do. Right. Both sides lose around 4,000 dead, wounded, and captured.
Yeah.
But the French get about 5,000 sick, and the British get about 12,000 sick.
Yep. And I just reading Marshal Bernadotte, who was in charge of the French side, he kind of knew if he just waited them out that mosquitoes and disease would take care of the British.
Exactly, right. We've got some modern historians and sort of infectious disease experts have looked at sort of the what's described both by the doctors and by the memoirists as the symptoms, and they've come to the conclusion that what's referred to as the Walcheren fever is actually a really nasty combination of malaria, typhus, typhoid, and dysentery, which is just not a set of diseases you want.
No, certainly not all at the same time.
Seriously. So, I mean, it kills several thousand. As I said, infects over 12,000.
Okay, so does Kincaid? I know the British eventually evacuate just due to their losses. Does he evacuate with them, or what happens to him in this time?
He evacuates early. So he lasts about 3 weeks. In Walcheren, as he says, playing at soldiers, and then he gets what he describes as this horrible ague, which is of course the Walcheren fever, and he's invalided back to Scotland, where over the course of nearly a year he recovers.
Wow.
He credits his native air for the recovery. Which is possible, but I also think it's probably being, fed and having access to clean water and just not being bitten constantly by mosquitoes.
Right. But yeah, I mean, not the way you want your military career to start out.
No, very much not. It's funny. He's sort of the way he divides his memoirs is roughly sort of a chapter per significant thing. And he does end the first chapter with Walcheren, because he's like, I don't want to start my second chapter still in here. We're going to start the second chapter with the next campaign. The first chapter is exactly 3 pages long.
Yeah, sounds like we arrived. It was awful. We left.
Yeah. That's pretty much exactly it. It's a 1-star TripAdvisor review.
Yeah, I'd say. So where does our protagonist go next?
So it takes him nearly a full year to recover, as I said. But when he's finally fit, he rejoins the 95th in the spring of 1810, and he shows up at the barracks to find that his company isn't there. they've been dispatched to the peninsula to reinforce Wellington.
Okay, so yeah, they're already in Spain and Portugal, so they kind of left him behind.
So they're not quite there yet, actually. So he's 2nd Battalion, and the 1st Battalion is already in Spain and Portugal.
Got it.
But his company is actually waiting off of Spithead to sail for the Iberian Peninsula.
Got it.
And all credit to him. Like, he applies immediately for and is granted permission to basically rush there and join them.
Mm-hmm.
So he does. He gets back with his company off of Spithead, and then they sail to Lisbon.
Mm-hmm.
And he's not overly fond of the boat. He describes it as extremely leaky, and the captain is a total rogue. And shows up in Lisbon and is thoroughly unimpressed. He says at one point, sort of, there's no city viewed from the water. There's no city like Lisbon that promises more and reneges less,
right?
Or that promises more and delivers less, rather.
Right. But it's funny to hear that description, because now we know, like, Lisbon's like this beautiful, amazing city that people would love to go to, and I guess at that time it was not. So
yeah. He's also to mention, he's not the most worldly traveled, like, I'm going to look at other cultures thing. He's a little bit xenophobic in places.
Okay.
So, but he leaves Lisbon. He goes up the Tagus. And his draft of reinforcements actually first experiences the Peninsular War as a retreat.
Mm-hmm.
He joins up with the army at Coimbra on their way back from the Battle of Busaco.
Oh, yeah.
And they retreat back to Torres Vedras. And he says, look, this is not bad by the experiences of the veterans and by the experiences of what I experienced later. But because this is new to me, it hammered me. He talks about being not prepared, not being ready to carry that amount of weight, not knowing to hold on to his food and his water and all of that stuff.
Right.
So it really does read almost like, first letter home from boot camp.
Right. This isn't what I signed up for.
Yeah. I mean, and in fairness to him, he's relatively cheerful throughout, although obviously he's writing in the 1820s.
Right.
But he is very clear about, like, I was not ready for this.
Right. So he arrives at the lines of Torres Vedras, which, Wellington and Beresford had erected, and Marshal Massena had to stop in front of. And what kind of happens from there?
So he forms part of the garrison of Torres Vedras, makes it clear that, he saw basically one redoubt. He actually says, those who wish a description of the lines must read Napier or someone else who knows all about them. Don't look at me. I'm telling you about this one hill.
Right.
But he sort of, he does sort of recall Massena's stopping there, and basically says, if I was Massena, I would have done things differently. I would have tried to force them earlier, and then realized when I couldn't, I would have just retreated.
Right.
But he's with Wellington when Wellington follows Massena.
Yeah.
And he sees action in the way we would describe it. For the first time at Santarem.
Okay.
And he goes through a bunch of the small actions there. He goes to Santarem, then Pombal, Redina, Castelnova. He first gets sort of hit by the true impact of war, quite literally, at Faz de Rus, where he's knocked unconscious by a musket ball that hits him above the left ear.
Wow.
Yeah, so clearly, enough long range that it's not a killing blow.
Right.
But still with enough power, and he credits his cap with saving his life.
I don't want a musket ball anywhere near my head or ear. So
right. Yeah. He recalls that he wakes up and his head is pounding, and he's utterly convinced that none of it exists above the mouth. And he's sort of very carefully prodding it with his hands and with his fingers and thumbs.
Wow, he's lucky.
Yeah, very much so. Finds his cap 15 yards away. And that's 35 feet for the American and British listeners, and rejoins the light companies, the skirmishers, basically.
Yeah.
Encounters a soldier of the 60th, the Royal American Rifles, who basically says, "Oh, you're from the 95th. One of your officers died over there," and points to where Kincaid was. And Kincaid responds by, "Oh yeah, I was that corpse."
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not dead, but yeah, that probably was me if over there.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
funny. Well, yeah, I mean, those particular actions. I mean, Wellington was fighting Massena, who was a pretty smart guy, and Marshal Ney, who was a pretty brave guy. So I'm sure it was a slugfest in Portugal and Spain there.
Absolutely, absolutely, and he's right at what what we would call the sharp end, right? He's in the skirmish line, so he's the first on and the last off.
Right.
But yeah, he walks away with just a concussion. Talks about how gratifying dinner is after you've been wounded.
Sure.
And yeah, so you can't argue with that. And then keeps going, right? He's at Sabugal. He's the first battle that he's in that sort of we would recognize as just sort of the crossed swords on the map of the Peninsular War. The ones that are important enough to rate a mention is Fuentes d'Onoro.
Yeah, like a real set piece battle.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he's there. He's then at Fuente Ginaldo and Aldea de Pont.
Okay.
And then he's clearly doing well, because in May of 1811 he's made first lieutenant in the 95th.
All right.
And he's given command of the 95th Highland Company.
Mm-hmm.
Because the 95th doesn't have like a light company and a grenadier company, but they've got to organize these things somehow. So it's like, we're just going to put all the Highland Scots in one of them, and you're Scottish, so we're going to put you in charge.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in charge of these guys, and he leads a detachment of them in a storming party at Ciudad Rodrigo.
Oh wow. Yeah.
So he's very much in the forefront of Ciudad Rodrigo.
Yeah, and that's where Black Bob Crawford lost his life. And that's, So that was a vicious battle, and he was the commander of the light division. Yeah,
exactly. So that sort of the light division loses, not only its head but many of its men. And sort of, he's there at a storming party. He says that he would be dead. He wouldn't be writing this, except when he made the breach, he went left rather than right.
Mm-hmm.
Upon gaining the town, and the detachment that he was with that went right was wiped out by a detonating magazine.
Wow.
Yeah, but he went left.
Again, lucky.
Very much so. Very much so.
Right. And just so my audience knows, with the sieges, and I was just talking about it in my last episode, usually they make a breach in the wall, they offer the town to surrender. And if they do, they, usually go somewhat light on the inhabitants. But if they turn it down, that's where they kind of say all bets are off, right?
Yeah. So, sieges are one of, it's funny because they are one of the both in this period, like one of the most scientific, right, portions of war. They're held up as sort of the ideal enlightenment of war.
Mm-hmm.
And they are the ones governed by some of the most rules.
Mm-hmm.
But if they turn down that surrender, and if it goes to a storm and sack, all bets are off.
Mm-hmm.
If your readers are interested in that particular aspect, Gavin Daly, who's an Australian academic, just wrote a fantastic book on that called Storm and Sack, which talks about all of that, and actually really interestingly sort of does a deep reading of some of the people who write their memoirs about this stuff.
Okay. All right.
Well worth looking into.
All right. So we got two good book recommendations now. Okay.
Yeah,
good.
Absolutely.
All right. So the sacking is going on. He saves a woman who's being attacked. What kind of happens from there?
So he's basically his he and his company are given basically they're ordered to patrol the walls,
mm-hmm.
and sort of make sure basically that the chaos is limited to the walled city.
Right.
And that's what he does. He comments that he reaches the walls. They've already got the town, and then he watches a Portuguese regiment storm them. Again, very much in that humorous, like slightly xenophobic way.
Right.
We're already in here. What are you guys doing?
Yeah, we already did all the work. Yeah.
Exactly. He his troops eventually are sort of said that they can stand down. They stack their arms and sleep by them. And he says I can barely sleep because I'm so worked up, right? It's one of my it had ever been the summit of my ambition to attain a post at the head of a storming party.
Mm-hmm.
And my wish had now been accomplished.
Mm.
And he lived, right? Like that's the other big thing.
Right. He lived to talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So he most of the night he's sort of up and strutting about, and then he says, when dawn's light hits him, I think it's a combination of fatigue and finally realizing, but basically he's just wiped out because he looks down at himself and basically realizes he's covered with mud and dirt and blood, and the greater part of his uniform has been shredded.
Right.
And he's just like, oh, okay, yeah, this is actually, more serious.
Yeah, because when you're in the zone or that tunnel vision, you really don't have time to look down and look at your uniform.
Exactly, right. If you're worried about your uniform, you are doing it wrong at that particular point.
Correct.
But this is nowhere near the end for him for sieges, right? Because he goes right from Ciudad Rodrigo to Badajoz.
Another one.
Yeah, another one. Now in this one, he's clearly sort of, all right, I've fulfilled my ambition to storm a breach. We're good.
He checked that off his list already.
Exactly. So he's appointed acting adjutant of 4 companies of the 95th.
Okay.
And their job is to line the crest of the glacis and fire at the ramparts and at the top of the left breach. Mm-hmm. Basically, let's use the rifles for their actual proper purpose, which is long-range suppression fire and accuracy.
Right.
So he sees the slaughter of Badajoz, but he's not caught up in so much of the adrenaline.
Right.
Yeah, the front line. And so he doesn't actually get into the city until the aftermath. Mm-hmm. When the sack is still going on.
Right.
Talking about how, basically it deadens men's finer feelings and enables them to look upon the suffering of their fellow creatures with apathy.
Right.
And he records, the Portuguese brigade coming in and erecting the gallows, and basically that's the thing that calms it down.
Right. So that happens. How does he kind of move on from there? It sounds awful.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think he's really, ironically enough, he's really grateful to see open air battle again, which is a very weird sentence. But he's with the 95th at Salamanca.
Right.
And so I have to say from the beginning, he's a huge fan of Wellington. Mm-hmm. Right. He says it's like page 10 or something of his memoirs, or even that. He's like, I've been waiting to catch a glimpse of this guy, and he's everything I thought he would be. You put him in a group of 500 men dressed the same, and you could pick him out every time.
Right.
He's a fan.
Does he have a lot of dialogue? Obviously, Wellington's busy with generals and strategy. Does he talk to the captains and lieutenants a lot?
Not really. Just, the sort of, if they're on duty in the pickets, it'll be sort of, how fare you, that sort of thing. Nothing deep. But what Kincaid says is that he sees Wellington a lot. Because he's on picket duty, he's at the front, and Wellington will come to look at the layouts and things like that. Mm-hmm. So he says he sees the general quite a bit. Interesting.
Well, yeah. Moving on from Badajoz, where do we take our protagonist?
So he's at Salamanca. He's right there with Rory Muir about it being sort of Wellington's masterpiece. By God, that will do. And the move is instantaneous and decisive. Although some obstinate and desperate fighting took place in the center, the victory was never for a moment in doubt.
But at Salamanca, so he's in the forefront. He's in the picket line, or where is he in that one?
Yeah, he's in the skirmish line basically, and monitoring this. And so he's at Salamanca. He sees what goes on. And then basically he earns the payment that they all do, because after Salamanca he's not with Wellington like next to, but with the army when they march into and take Madrid in August of 1812.
Right, and that's a big victory right there.
Very much so.
Yeah, just to capture the capital again is phenomenal.
Yeah.
However, that's not the end of the Peninsula War.
Oh, definitely not. Absolutely not. So from Madrid, basically. Wellington realizes he needs to pull back a little bit for winter and all of that. The retreat to winter quarters.
Yeah, supply lines. Absolutely.
Exactly. So he winter of 1812 into 1813, they're stationed near Ciudad Rodrigo. Mm-hmm. And on the retreat back there, or the sort of withdrawal back there, Kincaid is appointed brigade major for the entire 1st Brigade of the Light Division. Mm-hmm. And so he's in there when the Light Division sees action at San Munoz, which is one of those events that not everybody would have seen, because it's one of the sort of smaller ones,
right?
But he's there, and he sort of monitors the 1st Brigade.
More of a skirmish, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. In 1813, he's no longer the brigade major is basically a temporary position.
Right. Because he's a captain. He doesn't get any higher than that. So I figured.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
It's a temporary thing. So by 1813, he's back with his men.
Mm-hmm.
And again, he's everywhere, right? He sees action at Munos, San Milan. He's at Vittoria.
Mm-hmm.
Fights through the Pyrenees.
Right.
Nivelles and Nives.
Those are all. Those last three are pretty big battles.
They are, and you know he's there, and he gives pretty good descriptions of all three, right? You know he knows what people are reading his book for.
Mm-hmm.
So like he's got his chapters, but every time he comes to a battle, it's basically a separate section.
Mm-hmm.
He's like, and here's the battle itself,
right?
So you can read about that.
Yeah, and if you're interested in strategy or troop movements of individual units, I think that'd be a good first-person account.
I think so. And one of the things I really like about him, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but he writes really well.
Mm-hmm.
The way I would describe him is almost wry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can picture him slightly smiling as he's writing this stuff.
Right. Well, probably he couldn't believe he lived through all that he's writing down.
Yeah. And it doesn't stop there, right? He's at Nivelles and Nives, then he's at Bayonne, and he's even at Toulouse.
Yeah. And just so my audience, just so everyone's keeping up, this is almost the end of the Peninsula War. We're now invading France from Spain, the Pyrenees campaign, and vicious battles with Marshal Soult, who's trying to protect the homeland.
Yeah, very much so, and in really nasty close quarters, right? Because you're in the Pyrenees, you do not have maneuverability.
Mm-hmm.
You are on the roads that have been hacked through the Pyrenees over the last millennium,
right?
Functionally, and you are limited. But they do push through, and Wellington's army is the first foreign army to step on French soil in a decade.
Right.
You know, no shade on Soult. He fights his hardest.
Yeah, and he's a good strategist.
He is.
Yeah, but yeah, it's just overwhelming now. He's got the Portuguese, Spanish, and British united against him, and it's just, you know, he's low on troops. He's dealing with conscripts. He's low on supplies. So Marshal Soult it was an uphill battle, literally and figuratively.
Absolutely, and he's not getting any help because over to the east, you know, we've got Leipzig, we've got the Sixth Coalition,
right,
sort of breathing down into France.
Right. So is he at the final battle at?
He is at Toulouse, yeah. So Toulouse is traditionally the final sort of big battle.
Right, and Napoleon's already abdicated at this point, but the armies don't know about it yet.
Exactly, it's one of those, you know, communication lag. It's like New Orleans, right? New Orleans is fought after the Treaty of Ghent is signed.
Correct.
But you know, no one knows about it because it takes a couple of weeks to cross the Atlantic.
All right. So Kincaid must be thrilled. All right, great. The war's over. What does he do in the intermittent time between this battle and Waterloo?
So he's 2 months after Toulouse, he's made adjutant of the 1st Battalion of the 95th.
Okay. So
clearly the brigade major and all of that, someone has noticed that he's good with paperwork. He's good at keeping track of this stuff. You know, I mean, it could just quite simply be the fact that he survives and he writes with a clean hand, right? Mm-hmm. But he's made adjutant, and he stays adjutant for quite a while. And after being made adjutant, he's kicking around. The 95th obviously go back to the UK, mm-hmm. and he gets leave, and he's actually shooting in Scotland, mm-hmm. when he hears that Napoleon has done a runner from Elba. Mm. And that he's been basically recalled.
So he's probably thinking, oh my gosh, I got to go back into that.
Yeah, here we go again.
Yeah.
Now, by the time it gets to him, the 95th has already left English shores. So he actually makes straight for Brussels and meets them there.
Okay.
And he's there. He fights at both Quatre Bras and Waterloo.
Under Wellington again.
The 95th at Waterloo were basically in the sand pit and the knoll opposite La Haye Sainte. Mm-hmm. Sees a whole bunch of really brutal combat. He has his horse shot from under him. Yeah,
and Waterloo, I mean, La Haye Sainte and Hougoumont, I mean, those are the two bloodbaths, I would say.
Yeah.
They're just the French are trying to push the British out of there. The British know that those are the linchpins and they can't let them fall. So, yeah, just brutal battles.
Exactly. And he's got... His narrative of Waterloo at one point turns almost apocalyptic.
Yeah.
You know, he's talking about sort of he looks up at one point and the gun smoke is such that he thinks he's the last surviving person on Earth. Right? It's that level of like of writing.
I can imagine chaos and fire and cannon and I read. I don't think it was Waterloo. I mean, it was Leipzig or Lutzen or Bautzen, where the cannon fire was such a loud percussion that you had to keep your jaw open, otherwise your eardrums would explode because it was that loud on the battlefield.
Yeah.
So that kind of level at Waterloo, I'd imagine as well.
Yeah, that's still used. That's why mortar teams are trained to say things as they launch, because their mouths are automatically opened and therefore they can't rupture. That's
right. Yeah. So obviously we know how Waterloo ends. You know, the Imperial Guard retreats and the battle turns into a rout. So where is Kincaid in all this? Is he attacking? Is he attacking the fleeing French, or is he exhausted at this point? What happens to him?
So he is in that charge. He's in the final charge, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lord Wellington's long wished for orders to advance.
Mm-hmm.
And as he said, sending our adversaries flying at the point of a bayonet.
Right.
So he's there, but after that, he basically just collapses.
Oh, I mean, what a brutal battle, and it's nonstop all day. Yeah. Whatever, 8-10 hours. So yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. He briefly describes the pursuit of the French, the capture of their baggage train, and the halt of the British advance at dusk.
Mm-hmm.
And he sums it up. It's the last line of the sort of the Waterloo bit. It's one I truly adore. But he describes it as the last, the greatest, and the most uncomfortable heap of glory that I ever had a hand in.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, like it is glorious, but like Wellington said, if that's a battle won, he would never want to have a battle lost, because he had to write so many letters of death of spouses and husbands and people that worked under him. In his dispatches, there were so many of his officers dead. It was probably very brutal to be in there.
Oh, absolutely, unquestionably. And he basically there's a line there that says, I have never yet heard of a battle in which everybody was killed, but this seemed likely to be the exception.
Yeah, just terrible.
Yeah, just truly brutal.
So good news though, Napoleon abdicates second time. The war is over. What happens to our Kincaid here?
So he's promoted. He sticks in the 95th, or the Rifle Brigade as it's now known.
Mm-hmm.
And sticks around as adjutant in the peacetime service. He's promoted to captain in November of 1825,
mm-hmm.
and finally sells his commission in June of 1831.
Okay. And what does he do in his later years? Is he retired? Does he get another job? Or?
He gets another job. So I think for about 15 years he just hangs out in Scotland. He retires. He is generally living the sort of the idle life.
Right.
But he clearly gets a little bored by this.
Mm-hmm.
So in October of 1844, he's made an exon of the Yeoman of the Guard.
Mm.
And then 3 years later, he gets a new job in 1847 when he's made inspector for prisons in Scotland.
Okay.
So he's clearly just riding around Scotland looking at prisons.
Right.
And making sure that their conditions are fine and their walls are serviceable and that sort of thing.
Right. When does the first edition of his memoirs actually get published, though?
That gets published in 1830. So okay. That's basically what he does. I think he sells his commission, and he's like, "Oh, I can make." He sees this coming out. He's like, "I can make my money off this." So he sells his commission.
Are they hugely popular? Or?
They are. They absolutely are. Yeah, they are. They are massively well received. He writes two, and the first one is universally well received. The second one is sort of. Okay, more of the same, but that difficult second album, right? Even if it's just as good, it's not going to be received the same way.
Yeah, the sophomore slump. Yeah.
Exactly. I'll talk about his memoirs in a second, but just to finish off, 1850, he adds the factories of Scotland in the north of England to his portfolio in inspections.
Mm-hmm.
So he's riding around even more. And in 1852, he's made a senior exon of the Yeoman of the Guard and knighted at the same time.
So that's where the Sir from.
Exactly, Sir John Kincaid. He sticks around for a fair while, though. He dies of liver disease in April of 1862.
Wow, he's pretty old.
Yeah, yeah. At which point he holds obviously the Waterloo Medal as well as the Military General Service Medal with 7 clasps, which is not a bad haul.
Yeah, I'd say that's a lot of awards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting story, our protagonist. Thank you for giving the details on that. Let's get into his memoirs a little bit, though.
Yeah. So he writes too, as I said, he writes Adventures in the Rifle Brigade in the Peninsula, France, and the Netherlands from 1809 to 1815 to give it its full title. It's traditionally referred to as Adventures in the Rifle Brigade. And that comes out in 1830. And then 5 years later, clearly inspired by the success, he writes Random Shots of a Rifleman. Which is the first one is pretty much a strict chronological narrative with obviously moments where he drops out to tell anecdotes and things like that.
Right.
Random Shots is very much more a collection of anecdotes. There's no over thread or anything like that.
Right.
Which may explain why it wasn't as well received. It's not as compelling. It's not as page turning. It's good. He writes well, but it's not. It doesn't have quite the same thing.
Like in modern terms, it was more of a money grab, the second one.
I think so.
Family-wise, was he ever married? Did he have kids or anything like that?
He was married. Yeah, his wife survived him, a woman by the name of Louisa. I don't believe he had kids.
Okay.
Although if one of your readers can correct me on that, I will happily take that correction. But I don't believe he had kids, but he definitely had a wife. I genuinely, he writes a fair amount about women, and I get the feeling the guy was over 6'2", so over 6 feet. He was pretty slender,
right? And
the rifle uniform, as we all know, is not a bad one to wear.
No.
So I have a sneaking suspicion he did okay with the women.
He was a ladies' man. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Especially given that sort of that level of he clearly had the gift of the gab.
Yeah, and the books sound fascinating. I'll have to look into these because the memoirs just are, like you said, they're wry, they're witty, and I think they have a nice appeal to the reader of the era.
Yeah, so they're extremely well received. The United Service Journal basically says it's perfect, and he's the beau ideal of a thoroughgoing soldier of service, and actually compares the book itself to the Rifle Brigade. Basically noting it's trimmed in green and its fire is brisk and effective. The Athenaeum calls it one of the most lively histories of the soldier's adventures that have yet appeared. Yeah. And the monthly magazine, in terms of true praise, basically says the book has only one fault: it's too short.
You don't hear that about books too often.
You really don't.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. There's a romanticism to the era, especially the uniforms, like the hussars on the French side, and there's just something about that age and time that makes you want to be there or at least witness it, which is probably why Sharpe's Rifles was such a popular show.
Oh, I think so. You get those. You put actors in those uniforms, and you get that drama, and people just eat it up. I did. That's those books are how I got into this period.
Right. They're intriguing.
My father threw me one for a Christmas present when I was probably a little too young to read it, and just never looked back.
Hooked you. Yeah, it hooked you. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. No, I thank you for all that. That's wonderful stuff.
Just one final point I want to make about the memoirs, because there is actually something really interesting here.
Yeah. What is the legacy of these memoirs?
Yeah, so here's the thing, right? So Sir John Fortescue, the legendary historian of the British Army, basically edits a version of them in 1929. And he says, the daily, he praises Kincaid's descriptions of his fellow soldiers, the daily routine of the campaign, and says that they are of real historical value. And as long as the Rifle Brigade lasts, his adventures will be a textbook for all good riflemen. However, he also notes and condemns Kincaid for, and I quote, a certain flippancy in his narrative of what Fortescue considered a very serious subject. Right? It's that level of sort of humor. Yeah,
the glib part of it. Yeah,
exactly. There's a hint. The way I describe it in my book at one point is it sort of sums up the madcap lunacy of war.
Right.
But there's a little bit of almost like a Blackadder goes forth thing going on here.
Yeah, like almost like a gallows humor.
Exactly, very much so. But to me, I think that's what makes Kincaid interesting and successful.
Mm-hmm.
Right? His wry sense of humor reads much more modern than 1830.
Mm-hmm.
And I honestly, it's not just me. Scholars, most notably Neil Ramsey, who wrote a great book called The Military Memoir and Romantic Literary Culture,
mm-hmm.
makes the case that Kincaid actually marks the beginning of the transition from sort of the sentimental memoirs of the Romantic literary tradition to boys' own adventures that became hugely popular in Victorian and Edwardian military writing.
Mm. Yeah, because it's not necessarily meant to be a historical book of what happened during the Peninsula War and Waterloo. He's adding his own touch to it.
Very much so. And he makes it very clear. Like he says openly, he's like, look, if you want just a history, there are other and better books to read.
Well, yeah, well, and circling back to where we began with your book, there's plenty of books on Waterloo, that start from 11 a.m. and end at 9 o'clock at night when Napoleon's retreating. But that's been so done over many, many other books. And like you said, there's probably very good books on that. And your book, you didn't want to do that.
No, I really didn't. I had to write the introduction, like the second or third paragraph of the introduction. Like, this is not a book on the Battle of Waterloo.
Right.
Right. Please, I'm hoping it's early enough that someone reading it in the bookstore will read that before they buy it and then, yell at me.
Right. Right. I probably got a few emails that said this isn't about Waterloo. Yeah.
Yeah, but it is about the culture and the memory, and it fascinated me.
Right.
And
right.
and as I researched more and I dug more, I realized that there was just so much. There is everything. There's balls and banquets. There's door knockers, snuff, colors of blue. Dozens of streets, taverns, hotels, all tied to this.
Mm-hmm.
And just sort of watching all of that unfold was just not only a privilege, but also just, and to put it simply, it was fun.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like a little exploring history campaign of your own.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I thank you again. I want my readers, I'd like to go over it real quick again to check out your website, lukealreynolds.com. And you can learn about Luke's book, Who Owned Waterloo. You can learn about Luke. A lot of information there, correct?
Absolutely. And for those of you who want sort of the more direct route, you can also find me on Twitter at LUREYNOL @LaRynol. And my pinned tweet is a link to the Oxford University Press site for my book. So, and I think there's a discount code in there that is still active.
Oh, well, there you go.
I will say in that it is an academically priced monograph. I apologize to all your listeners for that. But if you are interested but hesitant, the paperback is coming out in November.
Okay. Well, I'll make a note of that because that'll save a few bucks right there.
Absolutely.
But yeah, no, Luke's Twitter page is actually how I discovered Luke. Really interesting stuff he posts there. So I'd recommend following him on Twitter as well. Luke, it was a pleasure, my friend. I hope you can come back again soon. I learned a lot in that brief time that, 50 or so minutes we spent together. So thank you for that. Yeah,
my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It was an absolute delight. And I'll see if I can find someone who's even lower rank for next time.
Right. If you could do a sergeant or a private, that'd be fantastic. Yeah.
We'll figure out something.